And I just saw myself in those weeds as a queer person. I saw myself as someone who's from here, a native species, usually most weeds are, and that it's through culture that we pick and choose what is wanted and what will be discarded and what will be cultivated. And plants are just doing their own thing, just like queer people are often doing their own thing.
Hello and welcome to Art Restart, where we learn from artists who, wherever they work, whatever they make, are shaking up the status quo in their fields and in their communities. I'm Pier Carlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, a production of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we'll be speaking with fiber artist Aaron McIntosh. Working with fabrics is in Aaron's blood, one could say, since he comes from a long line of quilters on both sides of his Appalachian family. But for him, quilting has become an act of defiant documentation. Learning the craft as a boy, he went on to develop his own ethos and mission, studying first at the Appalachian Center for Craft in Tennessee, and then earning his MFA at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. In recent years, Aaron has placed his own personal history and metaphorical body into fabric sculptures that blend his familial and cultural background with his identity as a queer Appalachian artist. His work has been exhibited in a variety of institutions, from the Houston Museum of Fine Arts and the Toledo Museum of Art to Hangaram Art Museum in Seoul, Korea. In 2015, he started the Invasive Queer Kudzu project, a community storytelling, archiving, and art-making project focusing on queer communities, past and present, in America's Southeast. Aaron spoke to me from his home in Montreal, where he is currently an associate professor at Concordia University. I started off by asking him whether it was at all shocking or surprising to his family that their baby boy took up quilting. He immediately answered no, not at all, and went on to explain.
So on my mom's side, my great-grandfather, my grandmother's father was a very active quilter, extremely active. I have one of his quilts. It's the pattern is called a bow tie. It's very common across Appalachian, other parts of the U.S., but he was widowed at an early age and raised the kids by himself, 2 daughters and 1 son. Quilting was kind of a release for him, as it is for many people, but it was his primary winter activity. He loved it. He was proud of it. He showed it off. And my understanding is that was because his father, so a great-great-grandfather, also helped his wife with quilting. And so he didn't grow up with a sort of gender paradigm for this craft. And so I didn't inherit any of that. Oh. And my grandmother, Axie, from Flag Pond, Tennessee, is where she's from, close to the North Carolina border, was the one who put fabric in my hand and encouraged me to quilt and to sew. So I didn't really grow up around any of that at all. And, people asking the question like you're asking, no one really ever asked me that growing up. And, as a boy child who was really effeminate and definitely chose like dolls and more, female or girl leaning toys as a kid, I didn't, even though I grew up in a really strict religious household, I didn't have a lot of people breathing down my neck about that. A lot of other queer people from Appalachia that I know, I certainly have lots of friends from the region who have trauma stories. I have my own, especially in the ways in which the church would interfere with people's natural efflorescing as queer people. But I think oddity and originality and individualism are just so prized in Appalachia that I think that is in general why queer Appalachians might just do things their own way. And it's normally you kind of know one another when you encounter each other if you're from the region.
Well, speaking of the region, could you talk about how in your art you started to blend the landscape of the South with an examination of queer history and culture?
Before 2015, I was mostly working on quilts, like proper quilts, not necessarily for a bed, but are made like a traditional quilt, but might be bound for the wall, or sculptures that involve quilt making or piecework. And beginning in 2015, I had been sculpturally working on this project about my family's relationship to the land. And we use the word decolonization a lot now. And I have a kind of a backwards looking citing on that work that I think I had a lot of my own questions like, well, whose land is this? And why is land and connection to land so important for rural people? Why has it been so important for my Appalachian family? Why is it when you ask people to sort of index what makes home so special, it's about, in Appalachia, the connection to the mountains? I'd easily say that's a big part of my life too. There's something about when I'm like flying home, usually into Asheville, North Carolina's airport, seeing those mountains. It's like a different neurological thing happens in my body. I do feel like I'm coming home. But I wanted to explore like why, my family has a lot of interesting struggle related to land and land ownership and property. But my family has always relied so heavily on the land. My parents, until very recently, only used wood burning stoves. So that they grew all of their own food until very recently. They're now in their 80s. So all of these things are changing. But I grew up in a family that was sort of made do with everything. Like everyone is growing their own food. My parents grew their own beef cattle for many years. And I just wanted to explore that for myself and bring that into a quilting practice and an art practice, and at a certain point, a writing practice. And so I started taking on different elements. So I made a project about firewood and growing up in the woods and growing up in the forest, and made a series of trees that were kind of made out of my own flesh, and made a bear. My mom's side of the family are all big bear hunters. And so thinking about like, why was that tradition so important for them? And it's not important for me. And what do I do with a lot of these family heritages that I will like not continue? And what does that mean? And what is the burden of that? So looking at a lot of these forms, reinterpreting them in quilted or piecework or patchwork sculptures led me to also think about plants writ large. And I had a particular experience in the sort of the final weeks of my mom's mom passing away, that we were tending her final garden. And this is in Newcastle, Virginia, outside of Roanoke. And in that garden, it had grown extremely weedy, in her ill health. And so I'm out in that garden with my mom and her sisters, and we're weeding. And everyone's just talking about these weeds and just sort of, I think, channeling the grief and the sorrow, but also some anger, and just all of the sort of everything I grew up with, being from a gardening family, about how much people hate weeds and how it's the thing they hate the most. And sort of, I'm just sitting there thinking, in this time of family grieving, it was made pretty clear to me that my 5-year partner should really not be around the family at that time, that makes people uncomfortable. And I just saw myself in those weeds as a queer person. I saw myself as someone who's from here, a native species, usually most weeds are, and that it's through culture that we pick and choose what is wanted and what will be discarded and what will be cultivated. And plants are just doing their own thing, just like queer people are often doing their own thing. And, we are born this way. We are who we are. And then it's culture that we have to usually contend with. And so the weed became a kind of important queer metaphor for me. And so I started making weeds about my own experience. So I picked 10 of the most common weeds that I had a relationship to in the Southeast, and had spent time picking and discarding. And I recreated those in the kinds of materials that index my queerness. They are the archive sources I was referring to earlier, but also family cloth and things like romance novels that I used to read, and sort of getting from my female relatives. And so these sort of patchwork skins of queerness made these weeds. And, 2 years into that project, I started thinking about like, what's the ultimate like weed in the South? And then was remembering sort of all this pejorative language about weeds. And then, I had to take on kudzu.
Because the great thing about kudzu is actually has a beautiful leaf.
It does. It's often kind of like the shape of a heart or a kind of crown. Initially it was just thinking about kudzu as a weed, as an extension of a weed. And I showed that work for the first time in Baltimore and had a really positive reception from other queer people and other friends, artist friends. But a kind of common refrain was that like, this is great, but if you're going to talk about kudzu, you've got to get there with the mass. The first showing I had was just really, a small, polite amount. It was taking over one of these flesh trees that I had made about the work in the forest. So I started thinking like, well, how am I going to do this? And it was at that time that I had started becoming a little bit more exposed to this network of queer archives in the South, and spending a little bit of time in Baltimore just early on in like a 2013 and 14 really kind of opened me up to this really radical thing, which is that queerness in the South, one reason I think we're so suppressed, generally speaking, legislatively and by our conservative Southern state legislatures, is that it's very easy to sweep away the history of queer people in the South, because there has not been that much of it added to official state histories and to official state archives. That has to do with all kinds of cultural things: the predominance of the church, the predominance of shame in small, rural, isolated religious communities. So I initially thought, I want to do this project about archives. I want to grow this giant mass of kudzu about the history of queerness in the South. I got more invested in that. I started just visiting a lot of archives. I'm doing scans, I'm taking photos, and those get translated by being printed onto cloth, and then those would be quilted into the shapes of kudzu leaves and then added to this growing mass of vines. I quickly kind of realized the limits of an archive-based project, which is that to be in a region as especially racially diverse as the South, was to really see the absence of Black communities in these archives. And the more I would see that, the more I would, feel really salty and really despairing about these archives. Every archive is maintained by those who have the time, the power, the privilege, and the funds to carve out time to save that material, to make it known, to keep it, to preserve it and pass it on. So these archives also speak to the power struggles and white supremacy in the South. It's not specific to the South. It is all over North America and the globe. But it felt like if I couldn't just rely on these archives to, if you will, paint a picture or grow a kudzu vine in the way that it needed to be grown to meet the queer communities that I grew up in and know across the South. And then the other part of that was just really knowing how triggering to see the ways in which gender is contextualized from early gay lib until roughly, the early 2000s, for the way that we do gender differently now as queer communities. And I didn't really want to just be showing so much of the past and not also allow a part of the gender revolutions that we've been through as queer communities to not be in this project.
So how did you respond to those challenges? You actually went out and started involving the community. Is that right?
I did. Yeah. I was really actively involved at that time in my last 3 years in Baltimore with a project called the Monument Quilt Project, which is an incredible quilt project. And good friends of mine at the time, Hannah Brancato and Rebecca Nagel. That project doesn't continue in accepting contributions, but it was a project that was about survivors of sexual assault, sexual violence, and rape, sharing their stories. With my quilting background, was really invested in that project when it was first getting off the ground. And I'm taking on my own interesting project that's growing towards community. And so I consulted with them, and having access to that kind of project and seeing how it worked gave me a really good footing for how I would want to do my own community contributory aspect to this work. So it wasn't hard to start. I'm a textile educator, have been for 15 years. So, I'm used to teaching people and encouraging people to feel confident and make their mark and leave their mark. So mine is different. I was asking people to contribute a story, something about being queer in the South, write it on this cloth kudzu leaf with an enamel paint pen or a Sharpie marker, something that would be archival. And then those would get quilted later. And so I started going to community centers, to SAGE groups, queer elder communities, a lot of queer youth groups. Started, at the encouragement of friends, taking it to pride events across the South. The range of communities might be really small. It might be really big. Like when we would do big pride events in DC, I would receive over 400 leaves a day. And then all those would be quilted, and they're added to a vine that the day and the place where it was made is commemorated on that vine with a ribbon. So there's a sort of an archiving within the project of who participated, not names, but just in general locations. And And yeah, it was amazing to meet the community, and people were really receptive, really enjoyed contributing to something like that. And it really shifted my relationship and really moved this project out of really, in a lot of ways, my entire artistic practice. It's a project that I still have a lot of, my name gets attached to it, and I did originate it, and it originated in a space and time that's very connected to my own practice. But I consider myself a project manager and a steward of these stories at this point. And
And where does the vine live? I mean, it's not
Divine,
always on display, right?
it's not always on display. It has for the last, I'm happy to say that for the last almost 18 months, it's been traveling around. And that's and then, and then just a quick note, but, this project wasn't intended to stop, but had to forcibly stop because of the pandemic. Couldn't meet people in person anymore. And I ended up taking a new job. I relocated to Montreal for a job within my textile field. And so it is sort of seemed to be like a natural, not a conclusion of the project in perpetuity, but a time where it was going to go into a state of dormancy. And so there was actually a lot of kind of sort of self-archiving of the project in the months before I would relocate to Montreal. And so it lives in a series of boxes that are very well marked with the names and the places of either what archive the vine comes from or what communities a community vine was made in. And that lives in an art storage locker in Richmond, Virginia. And when it has been shown, it's been shown at Boston at Northeastern University now. And it traveled from there to Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri. And it's right now at Columbia State University in Georgia. And it's going to be going to my hometown next year, I'm excited to say, for a museum project about faith and landscape. And landscape as
Oh.
a kind of faith at East Tennessee State University's Reese Museum.
So how has your quilt making family reacted to your artwork?
Well, like many queer Southern people, I am various levels of out with my family. I'm a married queer person. So, my immediate family know a lot about that, about me, and love my husband and all that stuff.
But
And
but
my
it
parents
seems
have
like the
come,
community at large might know more since there's going to be a
yeah,
display museum
yeah,
in your hometown.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I'm 40 years old. I'm not really afraid to encounter that at all. Something that's kind of worth noting is that I always tell people, like, it was in a weird way, like as like a teen deciding to go to art school felt like a weirder coming out in my family because it wasn't something practical. You weren't going to make any money that way. I mean, when you come from working class backgrounds, that's of course what your parents are most worried about. I think I've always been weird and strange to my family because I'm an artist. And that's probably like the first thing. And I think the queerness part is, well, okay, might as well have expected it. He's an artist. So I don't know. It's like it's interesting. In short, I would say it has its challenges. It's certainly hard, and those are different levels of difficulty and struggle that I've had, across my life of self acceptance. But I'm really tied to my family and their ways. I think it's special. I didn't realize it as like a teenager, but it was really special to come up in a craft tradition. Many people don't. And another way to answer your very earlier question is that why do I quilt? Why do I do textiles? It's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of an idea. This is the first thing that was put in my hands as a material I could be creative with. And
It's almost like a
I
sense
would,
memory.
it is. It's a haptic experience. It's an embodied experience. Is how some people might want to academicize that, but it is like my go-to. It's like my autopilot. I don't when I am quilting. I'm like in my natural space.
Well, you use the word acceptance in relation to your family, and I want to pull the lens out wider and talk about acceptance within the art world. I know that in recent years, I've seen so much more writing and exhibits of fabulous contemporary fiber artists like you. But I'm curious if you have ideas about what could still be improved or changed in the art ecosystem to ensure that upcoming fiber and textile artists receive the same kind of opportunities and recognition as other top artists in the fine arts.
Well, I get this question a lot these days, as you may or may not imagine. So it's not an unfamiliar one to me. A semantic thing that I want to do with you and for this interview is to just remind anyone listening that fiber and textile arts are fine arts and they always have been.
Mhm.
When you go to any major art museum in the world and you get into certain ancient cultures, you're going to see that cultures prized making and sharing their iconography, sharing their religious views, their important people, their gods, their cosmologies, found just as much relevance in sharing those ideas and commemorating them through textiles as they did things like stone carving, woodworking, metalwork, jewelry.
Well, the problem, of course, is, as you know, fiber and textile doesn't survive through the
Yeah.
ages as easily as stone and
Yeah.
ceramics. So we actually have no idea the extent to which
Oh,
fiber
we have
art
some
exists.
ideas.
Oh, we
We
do.
have some ideas. We have a lot of ideas. We have a lot. We actually know a lot. I mean, and it's been through feminist scholarship beginning in the
Oh.
1970s of actually how much, for instance, just a short example, Elizabeth Wayland Barber is the most prominent person who comes to mind for this. Feminist oriented archaeologist and ethnographer. When the British were sort of discovering Egypt's tombs and raiding those tombs and bringing all of those artifacts out, for instance, so many of these things within the sarcophagi, but also the other things that were mummified, they were wrapped in cloth that would have been, of course, hand woven, hand spun, hand woven, hand harvested linen, all of these things. It did survive. They just didn't keep it and they threw it all away because it was considered waste. It's, I think, because the movement, which was led by a number of artists beginning in like the 1930s, roughly to the 1950s, who were trained in textile design, who did tend to be women, who started wanting to make sculpture, wall-bound objects, pictorial art, things that were not design objects. It led them to build what we would call the foundations of what has had many different names, but textile arts, fiber arts, the fabric art movement, the fiber movement, the fiber arts movement. And you have a number of prominent people, all of whom are women, and really do struggle to get a lot of traction. There's a sort of a hotness around fiber, especially in the '60s, that meets the hippie movement, and everyone is suddenly invested and interested in macrame and all these other sort of crochet has a renaissance in 1976, the American Centennial. Everyone gets into heritage crafts. So, so that sort of adds a sort of another element to, the fiber arts movement of the '70s. And it sees itself as its own field, but it has always not on its own terms, but by the terms set by others, either been welcomed into or shunted away from fine arts. You have even famous feminist artists like Louise Bourgeois, who very famously, like wrote a really critical review of fiber arts, and that, that using textiles and using things connected to the domestic sphere is not art.
Oh,
Um,
Louise.
so there's quite a bit of like course correction to be done with just sort of again generally how we talk about these histories.
Your bio states that you're committed to transforming and diversifying the next generation of fiber textile artists.
Yeah.
So, could you describe what you mean by that? How have you gone about doing that?
I put that statement in my bio because it is a really important thing for me. The field, at least in academia, as it was taught when I was growing up, was really rigid and really different. And I just remember, I remember being told that I shouldn't really put my queerness in my work because that's not what art is about, or that's not what craft is about. It should be open, and it should make the kind of work that invites like anyone to consider it and doesn't make people who aren't queer feel like they can't understand it. And anyways, I found those very frustrating critiques of the work when I was a younger person. And then at the point of like entering the field and being a teacher and being on the other side of that table, it was like, well, I want to always be a voice for people who do want to share their story, do want to share their identity in their work, to that be a non-judgmental and just a very open and accessible a professor who will be supportive of that kind of work. And I also am just really committed to this field, if you can't tell from my diatribe. And semantic correction for you about who is in it and what genders are at play. And there is not a culture on the planet that doesn't have a textile tradition. There are many cultures on the planet that don't have proper painting traditions or drawing traditions or sculpture traditions or, metal traditions, because there's not metal mined where they're from. But every culture on the planet has a textile tradition. This makes us one of the most diverse, just naturally speaking, globally speaking, diverse fields. As a field, it's huge. Sculptors,
Right.
well, sculptors can kind of work with anything, but like ceramicists are always working with clay.
Right.
Metal workers are always working with metal, but in fiber, we have basketry, we have net making, we have knitting, quilt making, we have surface design, the whole world of dye work and embellishment. You have weaving. I mean, it's a giant field with a lot of different subdisciplines. So it's naturally diverse, just material and technical and methodology wise. But we're also a diverse crew of who makes us up and who's invested in these different traditions and also their futures.
If you'd like to learn more about Aaron and read a longer version of this interview, just head to uncsa.edu/artrestart. Is there an artist you'd love for us to interview or a topic you'd like us to explore about changing systems in the arts, about things that need to be reinvented? Please let me know. You can find me on Instagram at Piercarlo Talenti. Oh, and be sure to subscribe or follow Art Restart wherever you listen to us so you can be notified of our latest interviews. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, and on behalf of the Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, thank you for listening.